The reason I spend so much time talking about this is I care about the media, and I want there to be two strong political parties in the country. And most of the people trying to hold the media accountable for the biggest media scandal in American history, as I call it, are on the right. Jason Miller, who works for President Trump, he tweets about this all the time. He highlights the lack of credibility on this issue. There are other people on the right who do it. That's not good enough. Okay. Byron York, very smart guy, writes for the conservative Washington Examiner. He wrote this morning in his newsletter on this issue of the press's dealing with their failures on Joe Biden's cognitive decline. Understanding the press's handling of then-President Joe Biden's obvious physical and mental infirmity is probably more a matter for psychologists than for media and analysts. There's some truth to that, because understanding why the media not only failed before but continues to fail, I think does involve a lot about human nature and psychology. I'm no expert in those areas, but I do know a fair amount about the media, so we'll talk about that. Eric Erickson, another person on the right, he wrote in his newsletter, now that Joe Biden has lost, the truth can be told except for the part of the press's own complicity in the cover-up. I couldn't agree more. The people in the media now who are writing about this book are ignoring the media's own role in it, and that's a vital part of what happened, and it's extremely important. Eric writes also, had Joe Biden somehow gotten reelected, the press would right now still deny his decline. I think that's true. It's an incredible statement, but I think it's true. And if Fox News had treated a Republican president's decline the way MSNBC treated Biden's, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Brian Stelter, who writes for CNN about the media, and Oliver Darcy, who writes his own media newsletter, and the rest of the media's appointed accountability voices would demand accountability. But the press will give MSNBC a pass because progressives will protect progressives. That's the view on the right, that the media is still covering up their failures in exposing what was obviously true to the tens of millions of people in the country because they wanted to protect, as my psychologist had, they wanted to protect Joe Biden because they didn't want to help Donald Trump win, and because they are just in general biased towards Democrats, and in part because they were threatened by the Biden White House and the Biden campaign that they shouldn't write about this or talk about it, okay? The press is failing again. They failed on this story. They fail on a lot of stories related to Donald Trump too, but I'm talking about this one because right now it's an opportunity that's being missed. Read anything, New York Times, Washington Post, watch cable news on the liberal networks. They're not talking with accountability about the press's failure. What's happening now is not just a failure of Jake Tapper. We'll talk about Jake Tapper because he wrote the book or co-wrote the book, but he's representative of the entire mindset of my colleagues, which is to blame Joe Biden for what happened and to blame other Democrats for not speaking out. There's a few Democrats like Ro Khanna, the congressman from California, who's being honest and saying, look, I didn't see a lot of in private of Joe Biden, the decline, but it was obvious. And the party should have insisted that he step down and not be the candidate earlier than they did. But he's a pretty rare exception. So you've got the Democrats, or the media rather, blaming Joe Biden and the Democrats for being silent. And you've got the Democrats, the elected officials, for the most part, blaming Joe Biden. He shouldn't have run. He shouldn't have covered up his decline. And then you've got the Biden team blaming the press and the Democrats, right? So it's a circle of blame. And I know it's human nature. When you've done something wrong or you're being accused of doing something wrong, what a lot of people do is rather than say, you know what, let me be introspective. Let me think, is this true? Maybe I need to do a hard thing and admit not just a single failure, but years of systematic failure. But human nature for a lot of people is, let me blame someone else. So the press blames the Democrats and Biden. The Democrat office holders blame Biden. And Biden blames the press and the Democrats. When you're blaming others, you're not being reflective. What I'm asking now is for Democrats to be reflective. But more so, I'm asking people in my profession, or maybe as much, people in my profession need to be reflective. Okay? So let's talk about Jake Tapper. Jake Tapper's position and his publisher's position up until this week was Jake was one of the hard-charging reporters who tried to get to the bottom of Biden's mental acuity decline. Okay? Now, we talked in the previous episode about the ways it was easy to illustrate that wasn't true. He didn't never bring up the topic, but it's clear he was not amongst those determined to get to the bottom of it. The irony is his co-author, Alex Thompson, is one of the few reporters who tried to get to the bottom of it. It seems like Jake Tapper and his PR operation decided that was not a sustainable position because the public record was so clear. And again, I'm singling out Jake Tapper. I could point you to the same kind of narrative about almost anyone who covered the White House for the New York Times or the Washington Post, other reporters for CNN. But the reason we're focusing on Jake Tapper is because Jake Tapper's put out a book purporting to hold Biden accountable and tell the full story of the cover-up. So this week, apparently, he decided, well, maybe he wasn't as hard charging in trying to tell the public about Joe Biden's loss of mental acuity as he claimed to be. So he's got a new strategy. It's a two-part strategy, and it's not a strategy about accountability, which is what the press needs. The first part of the strategy, okay, is to go from saying I was on the front lines of exposing all this to maybe I could have done better. Here's Jake Tapper on CNN Wednesday morning announcing his new position that he could have done better.
I think some of the criticism is fair, to be honest, of me. Certainly, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. But knowing then what I know now, I look back at my coverage during the Biden years, and I did cover some of these issues, but not enough. I look back on it with humility.
Okay. Now, here's a second change in Tapper's strategy. He's going to cling to people who did try to hold Joe Biden accountable. One is his co-author, Alex Thompson, who again did, one of the few who had professional risk and criticism from the Biden folks did. So then he decides, I'm going to cling to the folks who did good. The Wall Street Journal wrote one of the few stories during the campaign about Joe Biden's mental decline. I'm not criticizing the story because at least they tried to write the story. It's hilarious, though, the way that story's been built up as some extraordinary effort. It was pretty weak tea, to tell you the truth. It quoted mostly Republicans, not Democrats. And the examples I didn't think were that great compared to what I know and what we could see with our own eyes. So the story should not be criticized. But Jake Tapper also this week, as part of his change in strategy, decided he was going to cling to these Wall Street Journal's reporters. And he clung to them so hard, he called them heroes.
They're with me now. Two of the heroic reporters were covering this intensely during the Biden years. Annie Linsky and Siobhan Hughes, they are with the Wall Street Journal. They reported on the decline of Biden's mental acuity back in June of last year. The piece then, quote, behind closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping. Participants in meetings said the 81-year-old president performed poorly at times. The White House said Biden is sharp and his critics are playing partisan politics, unquote. This is not the first time you guys have been on. I said it last year before the election, and I'll say it again. The journalism you did was vital, and the smear campaign by Democrats against you two is disgraceful.
So that's Jake Tapper talking about this Wall Street Journal story now, saying that it was a disgrace the way Democrats tried to smear the Wall Street Journal reporters. And he's right about that. There were plenty of Democrats, including ones at senior levels, who knew full well that Joe Biden was evincing mental acuity decline, who attacked the Wall Street Journal story and the reporters and said it was not well reported. It didn't match with their experience with Joe Biden. Again, it's like through the looking glass for me because no one could take their denial seriously. You didn't need to have private meetings with Joe Biden to see his mental acuity decline. It was on offer many days. He had good days and bad days. So the decline was not as bad as some people said it was, but it was obvious. And it was also obvious from his limited schedule, his failure to do regular press conferences or talk to reporters. So Jake Tapper now says this Wall Street Journal story is amazing. These reporters were heroes, okay? That's not what he said when the story came out, okay? Their story came out in June of 2024, before the debate. And instead of saying they were heroic back then, what did Jake Tapper do in response to that story? He brought on Chris Coons, senator from Delaware, one of Joe Biden's strongest allies in Congress. And he allowed Chris Coons, virtually unchallenged, to attack the Journal story.
So the Journal states it was based on interviews with 45 people over months that were either in meetings or briefed on meetings with President Biden. They do note in the article that most of the criticism comes from Republicans, but not all of it. They said that some of the criticism was from Democrats, although they said it, on background or off the record. Have you heard any concerns from anyone who has met with President Biden about him seeming a little slower?
No.
None.
If your core question is President Biden up to the job? Absolutely. Have I heard from some of my colleagues concerns about the character difference between him and Donald Trump? Absolutely. Have I heard concerns about what Donald Trump would do if he were president compared to what Joe Biden has done and would do if reelected? Absolutely. And I don't hear a lot of coverage of the ways in which former President Trump makes very similar slips, mistakes, mishaps, fails to grasp who he's talking to or where he is. There's been a relentless focus in some news outlets on minor slips by our president that I frankly think are typical of anyone who's keeping a demanding 14-hour-a-day schedule.
Okay, so again, you got to give your guest an opportunity to say what he or she wants to say. But if you're someone who really shared the point of view of the heroic Wall Street Journal reporters, I would say you push back a lot harder than that. You don't accept the standard Democratic Biden spin of his mental acuity. You don't accept an attack on the heroes. It's not what he did, okay? So he decided in the wake of their story not to have them on. Now maybe he tried and they refused, but his premise not to have a Republican on to say, well, yeah, that's true. That's what we see. Not to have voters on who believed, whether they were Democrats or not, that Joe Biden suffered mental acuity. His decision back then was to have on one of the President Biden's biggest defenders and let him just, say the story is not true.